The man who fed on corpses, Yoshiki Hayama. You probably often think that it's better not to know about many things. Suddenly, your eye is drawn to the fortune of the day, on Myoto Astrology section of the newspaper. If you don't know at all whether you are 7 red or 8 white, you have no complaints, but if you know that you are 2 black, you can't travel or discuss money. You don't mind, you get rid of it, but somewhere in the back of your mind, it's persistently clinging to you. A human spirit flies from the roof of that house every night. Have you seen it? When that happens, children and timid men don't pass by there at night. This kind of thing is nothing. It's not worth losing your life to, but many people lose their lives because they see it or know about it. Let me tell you one such story. The school used to be a feudal domain school. After the Meiji Restoration, it became a prefectural junior high school. At that time there were only 2 junior high schools in the prefecture, and this one expanded to have an incredibly large school building and a dormitory like a barracks. The school was located in the mountains. The athletic field was as large as the Yoyogi Parade Ground, and on one side it was connected to the prefectural Shrine 30 Shrine, and on the other side it was connected to Kokubunji Temple, which is said to have been built by Prince Shotoku. On the other side was a lake, and traditionally one student from the school would drown there every year. On the north side of the lake's shore was a slaughterhouse, and on the south side was a cemetery. Learning must be done in silence. As if to prove a perfect example of this, the school stood on the border of silence. To top it off, as the Meiji era was about to change to the Taisho era, the population of the village where the school was located began to decline like water in a bathtub with the plug removed. All that remained were samurai from the old feudal domain, and the only people who moved in were retired government officials who received small pensions. The reason was that the village was a mountain village that had been built by the Lord when he was cornered, and had no industry. So they tried to stop the village from prospering by establishing a junior high school, but the problem was that 7 junior high schools were established in the area within 10 ri at once. Because there were too few junior high schools, only 2 had been established in the prefecture, but at the time there was a fierce competition for the House of Representatives election, and one candidate donated a huge amount of money, the color of coal, to almost every village, bringing the total to 5. So the number of boarders, which had been 7 to 1 room, was reduced to 2 or 3 at a time. In that one room were 2 fifth-year students who were graduating, named Fukaya and Yasuoka. Of course, there was a pine forest outside the window of the room. Beyond the pine treetops, the 5-story pagoda of Kokubunji Temple could be seen in the sunlight and moonlight. Because there were too many rooms for the number of people, the upper floor of the dormitory was used as a study room and the downstairs was used as a bedroom. Both were Western-style wooden buildings with room for about 20 tatami mats, and it was a little too lonely for the 2 of them. However, both Fukaya and Yasuoka were too passionate to complain about it aloud. Far from it, Fukaya wanted to be alone in that room if he could. If it was allowed, he wanted to be alone in the entire middle school dormitory. Yasuoka also sensed that there was some kind of misanthropic vibe in Fukaya. Someone who wanted to avoid people and enjoy secrecy alone. Yasuoka was lonely. He felt somehow uneasy. But he consoled and encouraged himself by telling himself that if he could just endure another semester and a half, he would be able to go to glamorous Tokyo. It was the end of October. Even though it was not the midday heat that would have been unbearable had they not gone into the water, the baseball team members, who had been practicing on the grounds until the evening, went to the lake to wash off the mud and sweat and to show off their energy. However, one of them managed to dive underwater, but was unable to come up to the surface. He stayed underwater for so long that the voices of admiration and envy turned to cries of fear. Finally, one of the baseball players, Sekikan, drowned. The lake reflected the bottomless, clear sky, making the color of evil even more intense. The blood of slaughtered cattle and meat processing plants must be enchanted in that lake, was the rumor that was carried around for about a week. Sekikan slept forever in a cemetery overlooking the blue-black surface of the lake that had slaughtered him. White flags fluttered like cheer flags, evocative of his life. Yasuoka felt more and more lonely after that incident. The room was too big. The pine trees chirped like stealth. The bell of Kokubunji Temple could be heard muffled in the shadows. This kind of situation led to him having a nervous breakdown and preventing him from sleeping. Fukaya, who slept in the same bed as him, was always tight-lipped about the problem. He seemed completely uninterested in it. If anything, it was only natural that Fukaya would have a nervous breakdown first, given the eerie, lonely situation he found himself in. He was pale, thin, with a thin chest, a large head and a small neck, and was a skinny guy. Moreover, even when there was nothing happening, he was lost in thought, giving people the impression that he was a very inconspicuous figure. But as soon as he got in bed, he fell asleep. He even snored softly. Yasuoka was annoyed that Fukaya, who usually seemed timid, was sleeping soundly, but by 11 o'clock he had managed to fall asleep. It was the night of the first week since Sekikan had drowned. After tossing and turning in his sleep for 3 hours, Yasuoka was beginning to fall asleep. However, he was not yet completely asleep, and was in a state of mind that was either the beginning of a dream or the end of a waking life, when he suddenly felt something around his face. His sharp nerves were like needles piercing him, bringing him back to reality like the cold swamp water. But he merely instinctively held his breath, like a girl who has been broken into by a burglar. Soon the light switch clicked and the room was lit up. Fukaya got off the bed, put on his slippers, and left, apparently to go to the bathroom. Yasuoka's eyes were wide open. He began to think about what he had felt around his face. Someone's breath, body heat, but it was just him and Fukaya in this room. There was no way that Fukaya would have listened to his breathing. Even if he had, there was no way that he would have been on the bed when the lights came on. And there was no way that he would have left so openly, flapping his slippers. First of all, why would Fukaya need to listen to my breathing? I'm having a nervous breakdown. It's a dazzle. A dream. An illusion. Thinking this, he tried to convince himself and fall asleep again. Fukaya returned soon after and turned off the lights. He got into bed and soon began to snore faintly. Yasuoka felt that something was going wrong in his head, so he closed his eyes, took heavy breaths, and began counting in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. 51, 52. 400, 401, 402. 1000, 210, 1212. When his head had calmed down a little and he had finished counting to 1212, he again felt the warmth of a human body on his face. This time, however, he felt a chill as if he had been suddenly doused in cold water, but he continued counting. 1,210, 1,214, as if turning his beats. Then, without moving a muscle or fluttering an eyelash, he pretended to be asleep. The light suddenly turned on, brightening and warming his eyelids. Again a shiver ran through his body, and he even felt pain in his hair. The light suddenly went out. Fukaya quietly opened the door and left. Had he found a lover? Yasuoka wondered. But Fukaya never seemed mature enough to think about women, much less fall in love. On the contrary, he was an underdeveloped, sickly and shy boy, and even if a girl approached him, he would only feel repulsed. In gymnastics, he couldn't even rise to the top of the iron bar, and was so weak he couldn't even reach halfway up the wooden horse. Yasuoka thought about Fukaya one thing after another, but he just couldn't imagine him having a girlfriend. So, could he have a kleptomania? However, Fukaya was the son of one of the wealthiest families in his class. Even so, kleptomania was different. No matter how comfortable the child of a family, kleptomania is inevitable. However, if it was kleptomania, he was close by and should have suffered the consequences. And besides, there hadn't been any thefts in the school recently. He must have had diarrhea or something. Yasuoka thought so and tried to get some sleep, but sleep vanished from the air in the room as if Fukaya had dragged him out. Perhaps 2 or even 3 hours later, Fukaya returned, opening the door like a gust of wind sneaking in through a gap. Entering the room, Fukaya purposely made his footsteps louder and flipped the light switch. Then he turned it off before climbing into bed. Yasuoka, with nerves as sharp as dust, could not figure out what Fukaya was, but he sensed that he had returned with a gruesome aura around him. He was definitely not the kind of man who would duel. Yasuoka wondered how tiring his mind over such trivial matters would affect his work the next day, so he began counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4. However, he fell asleep an hour before he had to get up. The following night, Yasuoka was extremely tired from lack of sleep the night before, so he cut his self-study short and went to bed early. He resolved to fall asleep before Fukaya, who was acting strangely, arrived. Otherwise, I'll be completely helpless, Yasuoka thought. But the more he thought this, the more he couldn't fall asleep. The room, and the entire dormitory, felt too lonely. What's more, Fukaya's behavior began to make him suspicious, as if he had stepped into a bottomless quagmire. As soon as the sound of the bedtime horn sounded, everything at that junior high school was done by horn. Fukaya came down from the second floor with a tap. Yasuoka pretended to be completely asleep. But pretending to be asleep when you can't sleep is extremely difficult. But something resembling curiosity deep inside his heart helped him to endure the difficulty. Fukaya got into bed as if nothing had happened, just like the night before. And within 5 minutes he began snoring lightly. I wonder if he's not going to go out tonight, Yasuoka thought, dozing off with a feeling of relief that was a bit like disappointment. And once again, he felt the same human body heat on his cheek as he had last night. He's definitely breathing. But with great effort, he continued breathing as usual. The light came on with a bang. Fukaya's slippers flapped toward the door. However, Fukaya stood in front of the door and opened it, turned around, and stared at Yasuoka. The expression on his face was indescribably terrible. A face of someone who had decided to die. Or a face of someone who had been given a death sentence. He watched Yasuoka sleep with the same snoring as before, and this time he returned like the wind, and without turning the switch, he twisted the light bulb and turned off the light. Then he left the open door like the wind. Yasuoka felt it. Immediately he quietly raised his torso and listened carefully. He could feel Fukaya's presence in the hallway, like a breeze blowing through the leaves. He quietly rose to his feet and followed Fukaya. Sticking one eye out into the hallway, he saw Fukaya's back as he ran soundlessly towards the bathroom. Huh? Maybe he has diarrhea after all, he thought, and sure enough, Fukaya entered the bathroom. However, as if by force, Yasuoka continued to keep watch over the bathroom entrance with just one eye. Once Fukaya was in the bathroom, he left the door closed for about 5 minutes and peeked through the gap into the long, empty, dusty corridor lit by the dim electric light. So it was the bathroom after all. If so, why does he hate hearing someone's breathing? What a strange guy. After 5 minutes of watching, Yasuoka grew impatient and was about to return to his bed when he saw the bathroom door slowly open. The door began to open bit by bit without making a sound. Fukaya was nowhere to be seen, even though the door was almost 8/10 open. It was as if the door had opened on its own. Yasuoka was horrified. Suddenly, Fukaya leapt out into the hallway like the wind, and suddenly jumped out of the hallway window into the schoolyard. A shudder ran through Yasuoka's body. But in the next moment, as if Fukaya's agility had infected him, he followed after Fukaya like the wind. Fukaya was flying lightly and quickly through the pine forest that surrounded the dormitory, like a ninja. Before long, he emerged onto a field as large as the Ogogi parade grounds. This put Yasuoka in a difficult position. There was nothing on the field to obstruct his view. It was overcast and looked as if it might rain at any moment, but at the bottom of the thick sky there was the moon. If he followed him across the field, it was inevitable that he would be discovered. But in order to keep sight of Fukaya, who was as fast as the wind, he couldn't go crawling along the ground. So, in a hurry, he crawled along his belly to the road that ran along the field, separated by a wooden fence and grass. When he reached the road, he used the wooden fence as a shield and gazed out at the gray scenery of the field. By then Fukaya was no longer in sight. He stood there in a daze. No matter how fast Fukaya was, there was no way he could have gotten through the field so quickly unless he possessed supernatural powers. He's on his belly, too, keeping watch where there are no obstacles. Not wanting to be noticed even by himself, Yasuoka walked along the wooden fence, trying not to lose sight of even a speck of dust on the ground in the dim light. When he came to a slight bend in the fence, he saw not the ground, but a figure flying like the wind along the road. The figure of the wind flew towards the swamp where Sekakan had drowned a week ago. Yasuoka was seized by a fear that he himself was about to drown, and he felt a shudder. But in the next moment, he was lost in a trance and flew off. The road ran along the swamp, slithering gloomily like a snake. The two of them were flying along the road like living souls. The surface of the swamp reflected the cloudy sky, looking heavy and eerie, like the skin of a rotting corpse. Eventually, The path led the two of them to the edge of the cemetery. When the lead figure reached the entrance to the cemetery, he vanished as if blown out. Yasuoka collapsed to the road at the same time. White flags and lanterns hung loosely among the pine trees in the cemetery, unrolled. New and second-hand stupas and gravestones stood in rows, with haggard faces reminiscent of the death of someone who had been sick for a long time. The cloudy sky peeked out from between the thick leaves of the pine trees, revealing a round space like a ghost. Yasuoka continued crawling. If anyone had seen his eyes at that moment, they would surely have jumped up and screamed. His eyes looked so feverish, like those on the top of a diving suit. And his eyes saw a terrifying scene. It was something that could not be put into words. Fukaya was inside the brothel of the new Buddha of Sekikan, who had drowned a week before. Where did he get the strength to do so? Fukaya's skinny hands easily lifted the temporary gravestone that the two baseball players had finally managed to place. After removing the stone to his side, he took out a hoe and a saw from between the hedges. The hoe made no noise, but quickly and furiously shoved the soil that had not yet hardened away from the grave. Yasuoka's vacant eyes watched this. He felt as if he had been cut off from the mainland and was on drifting ice. What was Fukaya going to do? He and Sekikan had never been that close. They had never even spoken to each other. The soft grave soil was splashed nearby, high up. The top of the coffin gradually became lower. Fukaya's lower body was hidden in the shadow of the soil. There was a creak, and crack sound of nails coming out. It seemed the lid of the coffin was being pried open with a hoe. Fukaya was crouched in the hole and not visible. But the sound of the saw definitely dragging on the bones dully pierced the lonely atmosphere where not a single sound was heard, even the faint sound of breathing. Yasuoka was left with only his ears. There was a thud, as the saw blade hit something soft. The stench of rotting corpse hit Yasuoka's nose sharply. From outside the hedge, Fukaya suddenly stretched out in front of Yasuoka, who was crawling on his stomach and squinting his eyes. He was holding the corpse's arm. He looked around. He lifted his chin a little, just like a dog would, and sniffed. An indescribable expression crossed his face. He then brought his mouth to the corpse's arm, as if to kiss the arm of a lover. He began to eat it with gusto. If Yasuoka had been standing or crouching, he would have certainly fallen. But fortunately, he was on his stomach, so he did not fall any further. In an attempt to avoid screaming, he suddenly pressed his mouth against the ground. The soil smelled as if it were rotting corpse. He himself did not know why he had returned to the boarding house. He slept deeply and soundly, like death, covered in mud from his mouth to his cheeks. In the morning, Fukaya was quietly waiting for Yasuoka to wake up. Yasuoka woke from his death-like sleep around 11 o'clock. Strangely, Fukaya was still in his bedroom. Seeing that Yasuoka had woken up, Fukaya said, "I've filed your absence notice, Yasuoka." "Thanks." Yasuoka couldn't finish. "Did you see anything last night?" Fukaya asked. "No. I didn't see anything." Yasuoka trailed off. "There's a lot of mud around your mouth, like you've eaten a corpse. You should wash it." "What's wrong?" Fukaya said quietly. But his face was brimming with demonic aura. And that was the end of it, and Yasuoka got sick. 5 or 6 days later the school trip began. Fukaya went on the school trip, while Yasuoka returned to his hometown to recuperate. Even after being examined by various doctors in his hometown, Yasuoka's illness could not be diagnosed. As he lay dying, he told his best friend, "Only I know the cause of my illness." With these words, in broken words, he recounted the scene in which he had witnessed a corpse being eaten. And so he said goodbye to this horrible world. At the same time, as Yasuoka was taking his last breath, Fukaya went missing while traveling. A few days later, Fukaya's corpse was washed up on the shore. His body was translucent, like marble.